Applied Ethics BPY 101 course on Hedonism. Good evening, students. I'm Dr. Sudhnya N. Kulkarni, Associate Professor of Philosophy, Department of Philosophy, Janki Devi Memorial College, University of Delhi, and I'm going to be delivering a lecture on hedonism. But before we begin to discuss about what is hedonism, I would like to give a brief introduction to ethics. And as I am going to be telling you, the word ethics is basically significant because it is a branch of philosophy which deals with how human actions impact each other. The term ethics has been derived from the Greek term ethos, and morals is again another term derived from the Latin term mores. Both these terms, ethics as well as morality or morals, highlight the moral aspect of human behavior, which controls or guides us towards performing our actions. The actions performed by us humans are then classified as right or wrong, good or bad, fair, unfair, just, unjust, and these ethical terms or terminologies are used to define and describe most of our actions that we have or conduct in relation with other human beings or living beings. Ethics basically deals with voluntary human actions. It is to be noted that whenever we are going to be talking about ethics, we are going to be focusing on human actions that a human being or an individual does out of their own choice. If we look at Indian philosophy, then we have what is called as Darshan Shastra or ethics, which has gone on to play an important role in an individual's life. The reason being, ethics prepares an individual in Indian philosophy towards guiding their life by controlling their desires, their choices, their actions, so that an individual is able to exercise control over his or her emotions. In fact, the 5 ways or vows of ahimsa, satya, asteya, aparigraha and brahmacharya are vows which an individual must try and develop in order to attain a state of equanimity or move towards a state of salvation or moksha. When we look at the Western philosophy, however, the entire approach towards ethics is very different from the approach that Indian philosophy has. The first mention of the term ethics or values or debates around it are found in the early Greek philosophy of Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. As some of you may already be knowing, Socrates was the teacher of Plato and Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. But it was Socrates who, in the 5th century BCE, wanted to awaken his fellow citizens. And how did he do that? Well, he went on to make them question their beliefs, opinions, as well as reasons as to why they follow a particular mode of conduct. Because Socrates felt that unless and until an individual will debate, deliberate as to why they are following or indulging or acting on a particular reason or action, they will not be able to go deeper into understanding the ethics or morals behind their actions. For Plato, in fact, a good ethical life led to the achievement of his ideal, that is, the good. And Plato felt that, in fact, if everyone were to develop and move towards the direction of good, then it would be leading to the development of a state, and the best person to rule or govern a state would be a philosopher king. For Plato, in fact, we find that ethics was idealistic in nature. But for Aristotle, a student of Plato, it was basically a foundational one. The medieval period was followed by Greek philosophy and it was followed by the medieval period. The medieval period has been dominated by the thoughts of philosophers and theologians, and 2 theologians and philosophers come to the mind, and they are basically St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. The influence of Christianity went on to dominate the ethical scenario, so much so that during this period, philosophy and religion almost became indistinguishable. With the rise of Christian philosophy, a new era of history of ethics came about, and it is in the works of St. Augustine the most prominent philosopher of the early medieval period, that ethics went on to become a blend of pursuit of earthly well-being as well as a preparation for the soul for attaining eternal salvation. When we look at the next towering figure of medieval philosophy, then we come across the work of St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas brought about a true reconciliation, not only between the Aristotelian science and philosophy, but also connected the Aristotelian science and philosophy with St. Augustine's theology. In fact, one can go on to say that he went on to amalgamate both the science as well as philosophy along with Augustinian theology. And Aquinas greatly succeeded in proving the compatibility of Aristotelian naturalism with Christian dogma and constructed a unified view where nature, human, and God were all interacting with each other. If we look at ethics in medieval period, the social and political changes that occurred during this or towards the end of the medieval period led to what is called as the rise of the modern age. This was because industrialization was taking place. Individual liberty, equality, rights, fraternity were coming about, and industrialization was giving rise to the concept of democracy, where individuals chose the kind of government that would go on to exercise control over them. So it was the individuals who would elect their representatives rather than some king or someone telling them how they ought to be governed. As a result of this, it gave rise to a new way of thinking in the ethical field. The development of industrialization along with democracy led to the development of commerce and industry, the discovery of new regions in the world, the Reformation, which was followed by the Copernican and Galilean revolutions in science, and the rise of strong secular governments which demanded new principles of individual conduct and social organization. When we look at the Copernican revolution, then we find that in fact it was Copernicus who went on to say that it is not the sun which moves around the planets, but rather it's the planets which move around the sun. And it is the same Copernican revolution which has been interpreted and applied by one of the greatest thinkers, Immanuel Kant, when it came to his ethical philosophy. Some of the modern philosophers who went on to contribute to the great changes in ethical thinking have been Francis Bacon, René Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, Benedict de Spinoza, John Locke, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill, and Friedrich Nietzsche. In fact, there have been further developments in ethical thinking in the West with the works of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. The most influential ethical thought, in fact, when we are looking at hedonism or the philosophy of ethics which is based around pleasure, we come to look at the work of the utilitarians who dominated the British structure of philosophy as well as the French structure of philosophy. And notable among them are Locke, Hume, Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and in Germany and Italy it was Kant, Hegel, and Nietzsche. The contemporary ethical scenario, however, is very different and it's a very different and complex area of study. The contemporary European ethics, in the broadest sense, basically attempts to cover a generous range of philosophies which run from phenomenology to the theories of communicating action. But much of the English-speaking world has been influenced by G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica, which was published in the year 1903, and it has been taken as the starting point of contemporary ethical theory. Others like Martin Buber, Gabriel Marcel, Emmanuel Levinas, Max Scheler, Franz Brentano, and John Dewey all have made significant contributions to ethical thinking in other parts of the world. But G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica looked at ethics and the ethical principles in a completely different and new perspective, and he was one of the most ardent critics of the utilitarian philosophy, and especially of utilitarian concept of hedonism and ethical principles. Thus, after looking at the basic structure of ethics, how it originated, and how it went on to impact human behavior on an interpersonal scale, we must look at the different moral philosophies that have been advocated by various thinkers to guide human behavior according to certain principles. Within these, we find that there is a broad classification of ethical theories in the categories of consequentialist theories as well as deontological theories. Now, if we look at the consequentialist theories or consequentialism, basically it is looking at reference to the results of fruits of action, and the value of an action is determined on the basis of the results or the fruits that an action leads to. So it's the end which decides the means. On the other hand, we have what are called as the deontological theories, which are completely opposite to or diametrically opposed to the consequentialist theories, because they focus more on moral rules as guiding principles and operate that morality or moral rules or ethical rules should operate independent of the consequences. When we look at the consequentialist theories as a theory of ethics, since we are going to be focusing on hedonism, utilitarianism is one theory which focused on hedonism. And whether it is the founder of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, or John Stuart Mill, both of them have worked around the concept of hedonism in their theory of utilitarianism. And it provides the perspective that the utility of an action, policy, law, and rule should be the basis of determining whether an action is ethically good or bad. The nature of utility an action or a policy produces ought to be considered for its moral evaluation. The moral judgment of an action is not dependent upon the action in itself, but the good or bad it brings. This theory basically went on to opine that one should assess the overall outcomes of an action or what an action produces, or rather the overall consequences. So, as I had stated earlier, the focus is on the results that an action produces. If the ends are good, then any means will be justified. This approach, of course, does not focus or does not take into consideration the value of an action in itself. For example, truth, no doubt, has an intrinsic value, apart from what good it might bring about. But if it has value for the utilitarians, only if it leads to an increase in pleasure. Thus, an action is right or wrong is dependent on how much overall happiness or unhappiness it produces. Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Henry Sidgwick are the three major proponents of the consequentialist theory of utilitarianism. The deontological theories, on the other hand, of ethics, as I have stated earlier, provide the understanding that ethical norms or principles are of prime importance. Moral norms and laws are required basically to define the duties of a moral agent, and Immanuel Kant is one of the most famous deontological theorists or philosophers who went on to argue that whenever we are looking at any action and its moral value, then it has to be done irrespective of the consequences or ends that it leads to. The end cannot justify the means. And he went on to talk about what he termed as the categorical imperative or duty for duty's sake, and which is one of the most central tenets of his theory, which is of moral philosophy. And according to him, the categorical imperative is categorical, it's a command, because at no point of time can an individual go on to sacrifice his duty for the sake of achieving few ends which are hypothetical in nature. So the ethical law, according to the deontological theorist, and especially Immanuel Kant, cannot be violated under any circumstance. The consequential benefits for the deontological theorists are not significant for making a moral judgment or an action. People's intention for doing an action is an essential factor for this theory to judge an action. So in other words, the intention with which an action is done has more significance rather than the results that an action leads to. Now we come to hedonism and how it originated and went on to be developed and adopted by the utilitarians. The term hedonism, in fact, has been derived from the Greek word hedon, which means pleasure, and refers to several related theories about what is good for us and how we should behave and what motivates us to behave in the way that we do. All hedonistic theories identify pleasure and pain as the only important elements of whatever phenomena they are designed to describe. So for the hedonist, pleasure is of significance and pain is to be avoided at all costs. And let's just understand that for under pleasure and pain, the hedonist has basically included both physical and mental phenomena. If you look at the earliest known records of hedonism in Indian philosophy, we find that it is the Charvaks. The Charvaks basically talked about skepticism and hedonistic egoism, where for them the right action is one that leads to the pleasure or brings about the pleasure of the actor. And the Charvak acknowledged that present, no doubt, pleasure is often accompanied with some pain, but despite that, the pleasure is worth it. In the Western philosophy, we find that it is the Cyrenaic school founded by Aristippus, which is amongst the earliest skeptic and hedonistic egoist. The Cyrenaics believed that pleasure was the ultimate good and everyone should pursue all immediate pleasures for themselves. They considered bodily pleasures better than mental pleasures, presumably because they were more vivid or trustworthy. The Cyrenaics also recommended pursuing immediate pleasures and avoiding immediate pains with scant or no regard for future consequences. We also have another thinker called Epicurus who went on to find or was the founder of Epicureanism who developed a normative hedonism which was in stark contrast to that of Aristippus' concept of pleasure as the ultimate good. We now look at two prominent hedonistic thinkers, Jeremy Bentham, born in the year 1748, who died in the year 1832. And as stated earlier, he was born in 1748 to a wealthy family, a child prodigy, and his father sent him to study at Queen's College, Oxford University, age 12. Although he never practiced, Bentham trained as a lawyer and wrote extensively on law and legal reform. In fact, Bentham was one of the first ones who went on to talk about why codification in law or legal reform is a must. He died in 1832 at the age of 84 and requested that his body and head be preserved for scientific research. And they are currently on display at the University College, London. Jeremy Bentham is often regarded as the founder of classical utilitarianism. And it was in 1769 that while Bentham was preparing and studying that he came upon the principle of utility, and for this he was inspired by the works of David Hume, Priestley, Beccaria, and thus went on to lay the foundation for his utilitarian ethics. Bentham argued that happiness is the ultimate good and that happiness is what? It's pleasure combined with the absence of pain. He acknowledged the egoistic and hedonistic nature of people's motivation, but argued that the maximization of collective happiness is the only correct criterion whereby we can go on to assess moral behavior or moral actions and can go on to lay the foundation of a moral theory which would be objective in nature and which would be applicable to individuals at large when they are part of a commonwealth or a collective group. Bentham's greatest happiness principle, in fact, states that actions are immoral if they are not the action that appears to maximize the happiness of all the people likely to be affected. Only the action that appears to maximize the happiness of all the people likely to be affected is the morally right action. So one can see that for Bentham, the greatest happiness principle is the maximum happiness of maximum number of people. And in case a principle is not able to maximize the happiness of people that are impacted by it, then that action is not worth performing at all and has no moral value. Bentham devised the greatest happiness principle to justify what? To justify the legal reforms he wanted to argue for. And he wanted to use the principle of utility to establish utilitarianism and as a principle which could be applied for maintaining coordinating, managing, and establishing moral behavior according to certain moral norms of the principle of utility. He understood that he could not conclusively prove that the principle was the correct criterion for morally right action, but also thought that it should be accepted because it was fair and better than the existing criteria which was present at that time, which are based on evaluating actions and legislation. So Bentham went on to develop what is called as the hedonic calculus or the hedonistic calculus, and he thought that this hedonic calculus could be applied to situations to see what should, morally speaking, be done in a situation. The hedonic calculation is basically a method whereby one goes on to count the amount of pleasure and pain that is caused by different actions. The hedonic calculation or calculus requires a methodology whereby we measure pleasure, which in turn requires an understanding of what is the nature of pleasure and specifically which kind of pleasure is valuable for us. Now, Bentham's hedonic calculus focuses on several aspects of pleasure that contributes to its value, which are namely certainty, propinquity, extent, intensity, duration, fecundity, and purity. The hedonic calculus makes use of two future pleasure or pain related aspects of actions, namely fecundity and purity. So what is it that these factors or aspects of hedonic calculus signify? Certainty refers to the likelihood that pleasure or pain will occur. Propinquity refers to how long away in terms of time the pleasure or pain is. Fecundity refers to the likelihood of the pleasure or pain leading to more or same sensation. And purity refers to the likelihood of there being more pleasure rather than being pain. So now we find that certainty, propinquity, fecundity and purity are all instrumentally valuable for an individual because they affect the likelihood of an individual feeling future pleasure and pain. An extent is not directly valuable for an individual's well-being because it refers to the likelihood of other people experiencing pleasure or pain. We now come to the work of Bentham's hedonic calculus, which was criticized by John Stuart Mill as being quantitative in nature because it was a method which was being calculated in a mathematical manner. So John Stuart Mill, a follower of Bentham, went on to criticize Bentham's hedonic calculus by stating that there is no difference between a pig and a enlightened Socrates. The reason being, if there is going to be no difference between pleasures and there is going to be no measure of the difference between qualitative difference between pleasure and pain, then how is it that one is going to say that some pleasures are more valuable because of the fact that human beings desire them rather than animals desire them? So John Stuart Mill went on to criticize Jeremy Bentham's presentation of hedonism, and his hedonism differs from Bentham in his understanding of the nature of pleasure. He argued that pleasures vary in quality and they're either higher or lower, but he went on to talk about how the distinction between higher and lower pleasures is important, and that is why he went on to criticize Bentham's hedonism. For Mill, lower pleasures are associated with the body and higher pleasures are associated with our intellect. And he justified by saying that those who have experienced both the lower as well as the intellectual pleasures know that higher pleasures are far more valuable. Therefore, we often qualify or define Mill's hedonism as qualitative hedonism. If we look at the criticism of utilitarianism, both the works of classical utilitarianism of Bentham and Mill have been criticized on the basis of the fact that you cannot judge actions only on the basis of their consequences alone. Further, consequences are to be assessed on the basis of the amount or degree of happiness or unhappiness they create. But each person's happiness cannot be the same. And despite the various criticisms, the theory continues to inspire thinkers who believe that the classical theory can be improved upon. Now the question is happiness the only thing that matters? James Rachels in his book has stated that both the utilitarians failed to understand the difference between two important questions. And they failed to answer that for them right actions are those that produce the most good. But humans beings, we value all different kinds of things, and happiness cannot be always analyzed in terms of good it brings. Rather, it is a response that we have towards certain values, creations, and relationships. As stated earlier, utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory, therefore only results are of significance to them. Thinkers have argued that the principle of utility is incompatible with the ideas of justice, rights, and equality. The reason being, justice demands that individuals are treated fairly and equally, but the principle of utility challenges this basic principle of justice. Even with reference to rights, the utilitarian theory is unable to understand that individuals have certain rights that are sacrosanct and cannot be disregarded for the cause of good results. An important criticism of utilitarianism is that it is completely focused on results and therefore on the future. In other words, it ignores the fact that there are certain events which are significant even though they may have occurred in the past. And utilitarianism as a theory completely ignores backward-looking considerations. If we look at the work of G.E. Moore, and as I had stated earlier, in his work of Principia Ethica, published in the year 1903, Moore went on to talk about how the hedonistic calculus used by the classical utilitarianism was not there to promote the good, but believed that good included far more than what could be reduced to pleasure. He went on to talk about how beauty was an intrinsic good. A beautiful object had a value independent of any pleasure it might generate in a viewer. Thus, for G.E. Moore, both the utilitarian thinkers, Jeremy Bentham as well as John Stuart Mill, failed to understand that there is this principle of organic unity, which is vague, but organic is used to denote the fact that a whole has far more intrinsic value and as compared to the value of its part. And Moore suggested that there are three intrinsic goods, namely pleasure, friendship, and aesthetic enjoyment, which are equally important when we come to look at right actions and assessing actions. Thus, we find that the utilitarianism as an expression of hedonism has had its challenges, but despite that, there have been contemporary thinkers who have looked at it from different perspectives. I hope that the presentation on hedonism has been able to clear certain doubts and give you a clarity regarding what hedonism is all about. Thank you very much.